Okay, we'll get started. Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar today. The title for today's webinar is the International Assessment of Priority Environmental Issues for Land-Based and Offshore Wind Energy Development. This is the 19th webinar for WREN. And just to give, let's see if I can, oops. I'll give a quick agenda and then we'll start with the webinar. After the welcome and introduction to WREN, we'll talk about the assessment and methodologies, and then spend some time focused on the results for land-based wind and have a panel discussion with a couple of experts. Then move on to offshore wind results and panel discussion with experts from WREN, and then talk about some of the key outcomes and next steps. And then hopefully we'll have 10 or so minutes for questions from the audience. So WREN is short for Working Together to Resolve Environmental Effects of Wind Energy. It is the 34th task of the International Energy Agency Wind Technology Collaboration Program. WREN was initiated in October of 2012 and is in its third phase, which began in 2020 and will end in September 2024. We currently have 13 member countries participating in WREN. And the purpose is to serve as an international forum for supporting the deployment of wind energy through a better understanding of environmental issues, particularly those related to monitoring programs and mitigation strategies. And a few of the things that WREN is focused on is identifying priority international needs for further research, and that's the focus of today's webinar. And to aggregate and disseminate information on the global state of the science. We do this through webinars, short science summaries, reports, and publications. And all of these can be found on the TIFA's website with the link here on the slide. And then also, we are in the process of developing a monitoring and minimization technologies tool. This is a list of technologies that are in various stages of research and development. And we hope to release this web-based list of technologies within the next couple of months. So that will be available for review soon. Before we get started with today's webinar topic, I want to acknowledge and thank Karen Sinclair for all her work for WREN. Karen has been with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory for about 30 years, and the vast majority of that has been involved with leading NREL's environmental portfolio, which included being the operating agent for WREN. So she managed WREN from 2012 to 2018, which included, standing up this task and initiating this task, and then working through the first phase, completing a successful proposal for phase 2. And then she served as a valuable mentor and contributor in the last couple of years. And I really appreciate all her help with this forum. She was the lead author on one of WREN's publications, but also contributed to WREN's other publications and technical reports, the 19 webinars that we've held, and the 11 science summaries and fact sheets. So just want to acknowledge all the contributions that Karen has made and wish her the best in her retirement. Okay, Liz, I'll turn it over to you and just let me know when to change slides for.
Perfect, sounds good. Thanks, Chris. I'd also like to thank Karen for paving the way for the rest of us to work on WREN. But today I'm going to be talking about the background for our priority assessment, going over the vision, scope, objectives, as well as the methods and land-based results. So the vision of this WREN priority assessment is to inform the state of the science activities that Chris has touched on by conducting a systematic assessment We're going to do that by using feedback from the global wind energy environmental community to identify future priorities for environmental issues for wind energy development. The scope of this effort was both land-based and offshore wind, and in the wildlife and environmental sciences fields. It was an international assessment, which we'll get into more later, and across a broad group of stakeholders, including government, NGOs, industry, academia, finance, and others. And the target or objective of this work was to identify the priorities for both land-based and offshore wind stressors and receptors, as well as the primary challenges to implementing proven monitoring and mitigation approaches. And we're hoping that these outcomes will inform the WREN years 2 to 4 state of the science activities. Next slide. So quickly, I'm going to go over the project team. So overall, NREL was leading this effort, but the whole time was guided and supported by a great steering committee with members from WREN and the Department of Energy. The main coordinators of the work were Rebecca Green, Chris Hine, and myself from NREL. The steering committee members from DOE included Naomi Lewandowski and Jocelyn Baran-Saracino. The WREN members were Liddy Couturier, Miguel Mascarenas, Roel May, David Newell, and Bob Grimace. But we also had support from the rest of the WREN community. And then participants were worldwide wind and environmental experts that were generous in providing us feedback for this assessment. The next slide. So the methods for this work really focused around horizon scanning, but we did this through a modified approach, which I'll get into. So a horizon scan is a process which allows for the systematic investigation of evidence around future trends, including research priorities and emerging issues in science and policy. But we employed a modified approach because through the results of our questionnaires, it became clear that we needed to include both persistent and emerging issues in our assessment. So the framework, how we went through this is organizers identified the objectives, we solicited feedback, and then collected ideas from a large, diverse group of individuals. And specifically, we used a horizon scanning technique called the Decision Delphi. The Decision Delphi technique includes scanning and identifying issues, consolidating and clustering those issues, reducing that set of suggestions through an iterative voting process, and then producing a final list of topics. Next slide. So I'm going to, on this slide, just go over kind of our process and timeline for conducting this horizon scan. On this slide, we have a figure, our flow of study. So the horizon scan was conducted during January to December 2021. The first questionnaire was released March through June of 2021, while the second questionnaire was released August through October. And the questionnaires were developed with the broader team, so with feedback from the steering committee, and that was broadly disseminated using a Google form platform. There was 294 total respondents across the 2 questionnaires, and 28 countries were represented. Next slide. So we've included the questionnaires for both the first and second questionnaire with the questions that we asked. So we included these because we wanted to show the general categories and themes of questions that we were asking. So we had general questions that were both demographic and around, you know, what's the state of wind energy in your country, and then specific environmental questions as well as additional considerations. And this was consistent across the first and second questionnaire. Could you go to the next slide? But in the second questionnaire, we did kind of narrow down the questions to help us do that refinement that the horizon scan requires. Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the geographic response. So the first questionnaire, we received 153 responses across 23 different countries. Most of these responses were from Europe and North America. 55% from Europe, 31% from North America, but we also received responses from Africa, the Asia Pacific, Central and South America, as well as Eurasia. In the second questionnaire, we received 141 responses from across 23 different countries, and Most of the responses, again, coming from Europe and North America, with 60 and 30% respectively, with a few responses coming from Africa, Asia Pacific, Central and South America, as well as Eurasia. Next slide. Now I'm going to get into the outcomes of the first questionnaire for land-based wind. I'm going to be going over the land-based wind's results, and Rebecca will be going over the offshore later in the webinar. So for the first questionnaire, we received 118 responses to the land-based wind questions. In those responses, 8 stressors were identified and 24 receptors were identified. Stressors included turbine collision, cumulative effects, several behavioral interactions as well, such as avoidance and attraction. The receptors included birds, bats, fish, terrestrial animals, and habitat. And then a range of monitoring and mitigation strategies were also included. And then the primary challenges, which was another set of questions, were grouped into 4 main categories. These were environmental science, financial, regulatory, and societal challenges. And next slide. So now going into the questionnaire 2 responses, the team went through and coded responses from questionnaire 1 and essentially funneled those into questionnaire 2 and sent that out, and these were the results. So the top stressor responses as it related to land-based wind were turbine collision with 42%, cumulative effects with 26%, avoidance with 7%, and displacement for 7%. So those were the stressors. And then for the receptors, the greatest number of responses came in for birds and then bats. And then within the birds category, birds in general were the largest response, as well as raptors and eagles, each with 35%. And then soaring birds, 14%, grassland nesting birds, 7%, and then migratory songbirds, 6%, grouse, and 3%. Bats were the next largest receptor response. Bats in general received 77% of the responses, as well as true roosting bats at 22% and cave hibernating at 1%. We also received responses around ecosystem and habitat, as well as animal populations and mammals, but these had far fewer responses than the others. Next slide. And finally, I'm just going to go over a little bit more about the stressors by region. So turbine collision was ranked the highest stressor across all regions. In Europe, turbine collision received 48% of all responses, cumulative effects at 24%, avoidance at 10%, and then barrier effect and displacement each at 6%. And the results were very similar across North America, with turbine collision at 39%, cumulative effects at 27%, displacement at 18%, and then avoidance and disturbance at 6% each, respectively. And we included just Europe and North America here because we had a pretty small sample size from the other regions. And I'm going to pass it off to Chris now to facilitate the land-based wind discussion.
Okay, I was going to see about showing my camera, but I can't find that. Today, to discuss the land-based wind results and their thoughts on this effort are Miguel Mascarenas, who's environmental specialist and project manager at BioInsight, and Roel May, a senior research scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. We have a few prepared questions for our panelists. So Miguel and Roel, based on your experience for your country or the countries that you have experience with, which of these environmental priorities or issues do you feel are a priority?
Well, maybe if I can start. I guess that from an overall perspective that, I mean, things are hanging together. Like cumulative effects kind of cover both collisions and displacement, etc. So various aspects. And I think that is, at least for Norway in general, probably kind of most interest, although it's not kind of formalized in any clear sense. it is at least something that kind of we're most focusing on, kind of what kind of impact is there on species and on populations, and to address that. But at Norway, we have a lot less focus on actually assessing collision risk or displacement specifically, but more looking at kind of consequences of various siting issues.
Miguel, how about you?
Yeah, I'm aligned with what Roel said. I will just complement with one of the things regarding the main issues that were identified, especially the collisions. Then we have the displacements, and we can have the cumulative effects as a result of everything. I will say that the priority right now is how can we make sense to these issues in terms of quantifying them. So we need to have numbers. We need to understand what does this mean. So the collisions with the turbines. So in terms of correlating that, how many collisions do we have in each wind farm and overall? So we need to understand the cumulative effects. And then, like Roel mentioned, we need to understand the cumulative effects, not just individually on each species, but also at the population level. So that's really important. So I will say that the priority is how can we start to make more quantitative analysis and to bring some numbers so that we can be able to understand how important can be these issues, we have a problem or not, and then by understanding that, what solutions can we develop to mitigate them.
Okay.
And I guess maybe to add on that, to kind of look beyond kind of what was done here in the assessment, and also related to cumulative effects, is that, I mean, we're now seeing an era that probably sees a tremendous upscaling of the development of wind energy. So what does that mean? You know, we're now kind of looking from our kind of present day kind of, you could say, more slow development and looking at cumulative effects. Now, what if everything is kind of done much faster and tenfold? How are we going to deal with that? You know, do we have enough data? Do we know kind of what populations can sustain, etc.? I think those are also things that kind of we should not forget. And that, I think, also includes not only looking at collisions, as you can see, kind of that was the most important topic that was mentioned in general, next to cumulative effects. But what about displacement and disturbance? Kind of does that not have an effect, or there's no kind of a lot of worry about that, or is that something that we're actually it's much harder to measure? And it's just kind of, you could say, a human bias, is that we see birds lying on the ground, and therefore we can kind of assume that it has an impact. But it's much harder to see a displaced bird or bat or whatever. So that makes it also much harder to measure, but it could still have a large impact on the population by loss of further habitat, etc.
Yeah, great points. We're plans are to have to really accelerate build out and deployment. And we've got changes in turbine technology. We've got larger turbines, taller turbines that will help allow for that build out and move into areas where wind wasn't economically feasible prior to that. So that represents some challenges in and of itself, as you mentioned, Roel. So you both mentioned cumulative effects and some of the behavioral difficulties or challenges of priorities, such as displacement. How do we go about monitoring some of these, potential behavioral effects, and are there ways that we can try to mitigate some of these priority stressors?
I mean, how to go about it? I think, first instance, kind of it needs to be done, and also I think it would be very worthwhile if monitoring is also done according to standardized methods and methodologies, so that at least also you can learn across projects if and when kind of the data is made available. And I think that is very important. And the other thing is, what is even kind of with regard to the upscaling is even more important, is, you know, it should be done timely, because you need time to do monitoring. You can't just do it kind of a year in advance and think you get good enough data. So, you know, the industry must be made aware that actually they need to start kind of as soon as possible, once they kind of are starting to think of a plan to start monitoring, to be able to get good data that they can rely on, which also kind of reduces their uncertainty during planning and kind of allows for implementing mitigation before construction.
Yeah. I will go how to go. Okay, what can we improve to answer to this? Like Roel was saying, if I had to focus, I will focus on the standard methodologies. So the first thing is, if I need to understand, dependently the location I am, I need to understand what are the main impacts I'm going to focus. If I'm going to focus on turbine collisions and or displacement, for example, then I need to start with the design of the monitoring program. So, and I need to start it before the construction of the wind farm. So I need to start to understand which species can be prone to collisions, which species can be prone to displacement, and I need to start to collecting the data that will allow us at least to be able to assess at the end, when we are operating the wind farm, if the expected impacts have been mitigated or not. So what I mean is that if we don't know if there's going to be a displacement, we need to be able to monitor to understand if the displacement is going to occur or the collision is going to occur. Of course, when we make the decisions on the project phase, we need to make sure that we implement all the measures, not just in the first phase to avoid the impacts, but if the impact is expected, to mitigate it. So we need to improve our techniques, our monitoring techniques that we use. We need to improve our monitoring design globally, because everything is interconnected. I'm not saying that we are not doing, there are cases where people are doing very well, using very good techniques, but we need to be able to do it more globally, and needs to be more standardized. So it needs to be at the base of the wind farm, needs to have that monitoring program, a proper monitoring program. I will go to that. And technology also, what we know that today technology can help us to improve on that. And just keep in mind that one of the things also that you need to bring, and we keep, the WREN group has keep talking about that, is you need to have space for the adaptive management. So if anything that you didn't predict happens, you need to be able to get all the stakeholders engaged and be able to act. So if I have any impact that was not expected, but it has been a problem to affecting one species, we need to act. Not say, well, we should have talk about that. So like Roel said, there are always some degree of uncertainty. So we need to leave room to accommodate further on in the future that we may have the need to manage things and adapt our strategy, or to implement a new mitigation measure on the wind farm that was not predicted, for whatever impact that we didn't expect can be happening.
Okay, great. Yeah, Miguel, one thing that you said that I think we need to do a better job of is looking at this from a real global perspective. We've got animals that move across countries, across continents, that are impacted by wind energy. And so what happens in one country or continent can affect that species that has such a broad range. And you both hit on the standardization, which is really key, so that we can understand or better compare what's going on across projects. I think I have time for one more. So, you know, with advancing wind energy deployment and all the challenges that we have, where do you see our best opportunities for moving forward, resolving these issues, whether it's with collaborations or research or technologies? what are you, I guess, most optimistic about?
Well, I think on the one hand that it's, I mean, people now starting to realize that the climate crisis is connected also to the nature crisis. And I think that is kind of something to clarify that. Well, it's good to build out renewable energy to do something about CO2 levels, but at the same time, that will cost area, surface area, and therefore natural habitats. That also needs to be reduced. So people see it clearer and clearer now that those two things go hand in hand. And that means kind of we need to kind of stress that and say that, well, it's not without cost to build renewable energy. So that's kind of an opportunity that's kind of getting a bit more attention. And I think that at the same time, kind of there may still be, or especially from the more technological side of things, that kind of people are kind of would like to kind of develop wind energy as soon as possible without too much hassle. And that I think is important to also clarify that everyone has a responsibility. And here I mean everyone. It means the industry has a responsibility to avoid impacts and reduce impacts, but also the consenting authorities have responsibility to set clear requirements on how to deal with that for the industry. And also kind of, you know, even you could say NGOs, kind of the standard opponents in a way to development. They also have a responsibility to kind of share their knowledge and share their information about certain species, about kind of vulnerability, etc. So that together we can at least kind of move forward and try and resolve that. But that means, first of all, you know, the main problem may not be about the birds or the bats. It may be about the humans, the actors that are kind of the opponents or the proponents that need to, you know, go into dialogue and try and resolve that together instead of kind of being on the opposite side of the table.
Yeah, I will take on this last part of Roel. So last time I was with Roel, we talked about the social factor. So I will start with the social factor. So I believe the challenge is going to be the social factor, is the people, because I'm optimist regarding the techniques. I believe today we have we know the methods, we know the technology. We can do a lot better than we are doing. So the good part is that it's possible. I believe there are a lot of, it's possible to mitigate. Collisions can be mitigated. For the birds, you can use the shutdown on demand. You have technologies to do that today. You can keep improving them, but you already have them and you can use them. For bats, you can do the customized curtailment. Again, we need to be interconnected. It makes no sense to be doing customized curtailment, for example, for bats in a country or in a region of a country. Here you're not doing in the other region that is used by the same population of bats, for example, in a migratory route. So we need to start the social factor to connect each other, but we have the technology. We have to be demanding. First, we need to start by demanding to ourselves to do a better job than we are doing. But then by doing that, we need to be demanding to authorities, regulators, to do in the industry. Look, guys, you need to do better. And we have the tools today, because it's about the methodology. We have methodologies that we didn't have because we have the knowledge that we didn't have 15 years ago. So we have it today. So let's start doing. If it's about the cost of it, so we say to the industry, look, guys, we are accountable for that. So you need to pay it. So it's not, you don't have any more free meals saying, well, let's develop a wind farm, try to get an environmental license. I'm not killing, not someone saying that I'm not having impacts on birds and bats, but then we are having, and we don't want to spend money with mitigation measures because they have a cost. Well, you're going to have it. If you don't want to spend money, don't build a wind farm. It's easy because you need to make sure that you don't have impact. So it's the social factor that we need to start putting together. And like Roel say, I'm optimist because I believe that people today have more information. If they want, they have more information because we are all interconnected. The information is available. at least for when I'm talking regarding Europe and the United States, but even for emerging countries, we can share we share the information. So I'm optimistic because we have the tools. The question, or at least what can catalyze these movements to do better, is like Roel mentioned, and I agree with him, is the people, is the social factor.
Great. Thank you both very much. We should probably, in the interest of time, move on to the offshore wind discussion. So Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Super. Hi, I'm Rebecca Green, a senior scientist with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it was really a pleasure to be part of this WREN assessment with the entire team that you're hearing from today and the many participants that participated in the assessment. We received a significant amount of feedback, not only for land-based wind, but for offshore wind as well, associated with the acronym OSW here for offshore wind. So first we'll start by looking at the results from questionnaire 1 and then questionnaire 2 on the next slide. From questionnaire 1, we received 88 responses from offshore wind respondents. Through this first questionnaire, 13 different stressors were identified and 22 different receptors, which we grouped into categories. The stressors that were identified were similar to land-based wind, but also included offshore wind specific stressors, such as mooring lines associated with floating offshore wind structures and associated entanglement considerations, underwater noise, vessel collisions, and port build out as a couple of examples. On the receptor side, receptors included birds and various subcategories of birds and bats, as with land-based, plus marine mammals, fish, sea turtles, migrating animals, and other aspects of habitat that are unique to the offshore environment. Respondents also identified a range of monitoring and mitigation strategies, such as related to the monitoring of migratory populations, better monitoring behavior and distributions, and also identified a variety of challenges to monitoring and mitigation strategies, which we grouped into the categories of primary challenges associated with environmental science, financial considerations, regulatory considerations, and societal considerations. Next slide, please. We then, after analyzing the responses from questionnaire 1, moved into questionnaire 2 and received 80 responses through questionnaire 2 associated with offshore wind environmental priorities. I should say that stressor bias throughout our assessment associated with respondents' expertise was minimized by analyzing stressor priorities for each receptor group identified, regardless of the total number of votes for a particular receptor group. So across all receptor groups, we looked at the stressors which were most often identified in the offshore. Cumulative effects received the most number of votes at 29% of total votes, by far, I should say. And then followed by turbine collisions, displacement, and noise that received 15, 14, and 14% of the votes. Across stressor groupings, we started by looking at the bird category, which received the most votes. Within birds, subcategories of seabirds received 53% of the vote, followed by birds in general, or all birds, at 34% of the vote, and migratory birds with 13% of the vote. The marine mammal receptor category received the next most votes in the offshore environment, with marine mammals in general identified by most of the respondents at 60% of the vote, followed by cetaceans at 29% of the vote. And A bit further down, whales, dolphins, and porpoises individually identified. Ecosystems and habitats were also a consideration, including benthic habitat and pelagic habitat, as well as fish, food webs, migratory animals, hydrodynamics, and bats were all also identified by respondents. Next slide, please. We then, similarly to land-based wind, looked at offshore wind stressors identified by region. By far, the most number of votes were received for Europe and North America, so that was the focus of our comparison. We also received a couple of votes in the offshore for Central and South America and Africa, as you can see here in the graphic. Across all regions, cumulative effects was the highest ranked stressor, independent of region. Within Europe, cumulative effects received 31% of the vote. In North America, it received 25% of the vote. And then after that, the order was a little bit different between Europe and North America. Going down the list in Europe, after cumulative effects, we had underwater noise, turbine collision, displacement, and barrier effect. In North America, after cumulative effects, we had displacement, turbine collision, underwater noise, and also attraction and barrier effect that were identified. Next slide, please. So that was a high-level overview of the offshore wind results associated with the assessment. And now it's my pleasure to turn to our panel discussion for offshore wind environmental issues. We have joining us today Lydie Couturier from our assessment team. Lydie is a research fellow focused on the interactions between fish and offshore renewable energy development at France Energies Marinas. Sorry if I didn't say that properly. And we also have Bob Rumes joining us from our team. He is a researcher and policy advisor for offshore renewables with the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences. So thank you for joining us, Lydie and Bob.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, great to have you with us. So we will be talking through some of the same questions as we addressed on the land-based side. So for offshore, based on your own personal experience and the country or countries where you've done work, what would you say are the environmental issues that are currently highest priority, whether identified in the assessment or something else that you'd like to highlight for us?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I think we might be on the same line on this one, but yeah, the priority issue to, in my experience, my expertise is ecosystem effects on the marine environment, and also, yeah, of course, cumulative effects on the modification, because we know that implementing offshore wind farm will have an effect on the environment, will modify some interactions between species and things like that. And because a lot of the baseline knowledge on how species interact normally, even without our impact, is lacking. Even to understand the effect, we really need to have more studies focusing on ecosystem scale interaction.
Great, thank you, Bob.
Yeah, I think Lydie, you explained it quite well. For us, we have been working a lot on cumulative effects, and this is there's two ways to approach cumulative effects. One is looking at cumulative effects of a certain sector, for example, all the offshore renewables together, and there's cumulative effects as in all different sectors. The second one, which cumulative effects purists would consider that to be the true one, is at this point quite hard to tackle. And for the first one, we are starting a cooperation at a North Sea level, because we cannot tackle this as Belgium alone. We need the data from monitoring and from research projects within the entire relevant ecological scale. And for most of our species, it is at the North Sea scale. So it is a number of EU and several non-EU countries that will work together to try and address this. And the reason why we want to do this has been also discussed during the land-based session, is because the scale of development is going to be unprecedented. Over the last 30 years, about 20 gigawatt of offshore wind energy has been built in this North Sea area, which is quite a lot compared to the US. But in the next 8 years, we aim to build another 100 extra. So, and that's just for the EU countries. So if we take into account the UK, it's going to be more. So this massive scale of development means that we are currently as yet not comfortable with level of certainty we have on ecological impacts on birds, but as well as potential ecosystem impacts. And maybe for some people, it's not going to be entirely clear what we mean by ecosystem impacts. So it's how all of these turbines will change the functioning of the marine ecosystem. So changing the mixing regimes. There's several areas which currently have permanent stratification, which have seasonal stratification, where stratification is likely to be reduced by introducing these structures. There's changes to the food web because of the filtration by these organisms. So this is where several studies are currently ongoing, I would say, and needed.
Excellent. It's great to hear you both emphasizing the need to understand ecosystem level effects, all the way from potential impacts on hydrodynamics through the prey base up through some of the higher trophic levels within the ecosystem. Let's turn to our next question, please. And that is, what do you perceive as the challenges and opportunities associated with monitoring and mitigation strategies? Anything you'd like to highlight for us, please? Starting again with Liddy, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think Bob pointed one out with the need to have large-scale monitoring. We can't just focus on one area with the marine environment. It has to be a common effort for the monitoring. And it's both a challenge and an opportunity. So we now see like a regional scale infrastructures being put in place to get a large scale monitoring across like the Channel, for example, and even the North Sea. So it's getting there, but yeah, the challenge is finding funding to monitor immersed environment that's not readily accessible, and with methods that are often costly. Yeah, I think that's one of the key of these two, and also to integrate offshore wind farm monitoring into the already existing large-scale surveys that may exist in some region, and even like, for example, in the European marine framework, marine strategy framework, making sure that the monitoring methods that may be set up within offshore wind farm do match with the monitoring of other habitats, and to really integrate that all. And the opportunity is also to improve these monitoring strategies that are already into place with new technologies. I'm just thinking, for example, in the Channel, we're setting up a large-scale acoustic telemetry network to monitor fish movements and habitat use. And this will give variable data on how fish move, but how they use where are the essential habitats on different areas and how they use this habitat. And that includes several offshore wind farms. So we have natural environment offshore wind farms. So we have nice comparable studies, at least for fish. And this hasn't yet been used for other survey strategy, like I don't know, European scale survey strategy as a directive, like as a strategy framework. I don't know the word in English, a marine strategy framework, but it could be on the long term be integrated as an infrastructure that can help to monitor the habitats across the whole region. And it's also, we're trying to build that across the North Sea as well. It's an example of a large scale infrastructure. That's
great. Thank you, Liddy. Is there, Bob, what are your thoughts on this question of monitoring and mitigation strategies?
Yes, I think some of the opportunities have already been very clearly identified. I would like to focus on one challenge, which is that the legal and regulatory framework isn't fit at the moment to address these large-scale challenges. Projects are required to conduct the monitoring or to make their assessments often at the scale of their own development and not taking into account a much larger ecosystem in which they take place. So it's part of that is a task of the government to actually make these analyses at a wider scale, but also to adapt the legal framework so that the monitoring results become suited to this broader picture. And I think this is one of the things that also came out of the horizon scan that we did, was that for quite a few people the science is already there, but the legal framework is lagging behind. So so there's an opportunity to improve there. I'm just going to plow on. As to the main differences between North America and Europe, I would say we are in Europe a bit further along. We've had projects at a larger scale already, and I think most of the concerns now are about this upscaling and these large scale effects. No longer are we looking at individual projects if the siting is well, but we are now looking at these in combination effects of different sites and how this affects animal populations throughout their lifetime.
Great, thank you, Bob, for taking us through that last question there and pointing out some of the major differences between our two regions. I think we will go ahead and end our panel discussion for now, given time. But thank you very much, Liddy and Bob, for joining for the conversation. We are now going to move
thank you.
ahead. Yeah, thank you. Chris, next slide, please. We're now going to summarize some of the key outcomes from the assessment, and then hopefully have time for some question and answer at the end. So in terms of key takeaways or outcomes, overall, we found that our approach using this modified horizon scan methodology was effective in identifying priorities in both for both land-based wind and offshore wind. Examples of some of the priority stressors identified included turbine collisions for both land-based and offshore wind, cumulative effects for both land-based and offshore wind, indirect effects, including avoidance and displacement, such as an understanding of behavioral responses across scales, including at the wind farm level, within the wind farm, and at the turbine level. Also thinking about underwater noise, which was specific to offshore wind, methods for monitoring and minimizing effects across a range of marine life are needed, including for marine mammals, fish, and sea turtles. Examples of priority receptors identified. On the land-based side, we received quite a bit of feedback on birds in general, raptors and eagles, soaring birds, bats in general, tree roosting bats, ecosystems, which our panelists today emphasized, habitats and animal populations. On the offshore wind side, we heard a lot about seabirds, all the way through migratory birds, marine mammals in general, on down the list through ecosystems and food webs. Next slide, please. We also wanted to take a moment to identify some of the truly emerging considerations that we heard about in the assessment. A lot of what we heard were persistent considerations, but some are also more cutting edge. So we know that looking ahead, future technologies will be a consideration, such as larger turbines and floating turbines in the offshore. We may potentially see new stressors and new species in frontier regions where wind energy has not yet been developed. We heard a lot about the need to understand cumulative effects for multiple projects at a regional scale. And then we also wanted to identify some very specific responses around emerging considerations. We don't have time to talk through each of these, but just touching on a couple of points here, the need to look at the effects of disturbance on stress, communication, and fitness, looking down at offshore considerations. As an example, the provision of artificial habitat and effects on hard bottom species connectivity and regional dynamics. Going down to the bottom of the list here and thinking about climate change, we hear a lot about the need to discern effects of offshore wind projects in an already changing environment, and what are the methods for doing so, the required models, and then data to validate those models. So thank you very much, and Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Lastly, and I put this in the chat in response to a question, but we have submitted a revised version of our manuscript to Global Sustainability, so it's already gone through review, and hope to hear a decision from the journal soon. This webinar will it is being recorded and will be posted on the TIFAS website, and Haley put the link of where that recording will be in the chat. And then, you know, part of this assessment was to help inform WREN on its activities going forward, what topics or priorities we should focus on in aggregating and disseminating information out. But of course, anyone can use this information to think about their future research or partnership decisions. So hopefully it's of use to the broader community outside of WREN. So with that, we'll conclude the webinar and have a few minutes for Q&A. If you've got some questions, please feel free to put it into the chat. We do have one now, and I'll just open this up to any of the panelists if they have thoughts on it. Florence writes, why not reserve turbine-free corridors for bird life and the design of offshore wind farms? So any thoughts on that question?
Maybe I guess one of the issue in France, at least, is that we don't know what are the corridors where the birds travel through. So it would be hard to design offshore wind farm. We can make areas where there are no turbines, but we don't know that the birds will like to go through there.
Thanks.
And in addition to that, I can also kind of mention that we also know from we have in Norway a large-scale monitoring program on tracking seabirds across the Atlantic. And actually what you see that it's not kind of very obvious which birds you're actually seeing in a certain spot in a given season. It may be that kind of you can see Norwegian birds kind of during spring, then in autumn it may be birds actually from Scotland or from the other side of the Atlantic that is kind of moving towards Norway, for instance. So I mean there's a lot of dynamics there that we just don't have a clue about I think, and has very large scale effects that are large scale movements. So just to make kind of corridors in an area, well, it depends where they come from and where they're going. And given that they are kind of traveling long distances, that may be terribly hard to get. So I think you should kind of mainly more focus on maybe kind of identifying areas that are for whatever reason kind of less suitable for different seabirds if you're talking offshore. That would be better than to kind of try and identify corridors, because that would be probably nearly impossible, I think.
Any other thoughts on that one? Florence also mentions that in Switzerland, they stop turbines when during, I guess, the migration of bird species as a mitigation strategy. And Miguel mentioned at one point the kind of curtailment on demand when birds are at risk. So a couple options that are available for mitigating collision events for birds.
Yeah, we are looking at our wind farms are located in a migration corridor. It's so the Belgian-Dutch coast. Between the Belgian-Dutch coast and the UK coast, there's intense bird migration. Unfortunately, this is also where we have ideal circumstances for putting offshore wind farms. So we have, together with the Dutch, are looking at being able to have these turbine shutdowns during intensive migration events. So we are using radar to actually identify when these migration events take place. Unfortunately, due to the way the electricity market functions, curtailment cannot be done at a moment's notice, especially for these larger wind farms. We're talking about multiple gigawatts. So we need to predict them. And this is where we are currently working on, is actually being able to predict beforehand with either a few days or a few hours when curtailment would be needed. And in that case, this could actually be done.
Okay, well, we're at time. So thanks to our panelists. Thanks for those who joined today. And if you have any questions for us, here are Rebecca's, Liz's, and my email addresses, and we can always direct you to any of the panelists if you have questions for them. So thanks again for joining the webinar, and hope everybody has a good rest of your day.
Thanks everyone at NREL for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Sure.